The Nixon visit to China in February 1972 was a masterstroke of diplomacy. It stunned the world and altered the course of the Cold War in a manner favorable to U.S. interests. Above all, it illustrated the vital importance for diplomacy of leaders who can rise above conventional thinking, spot opportunities, read signals accurately, mobilize expert support, and act boldly and decisively in pursuit of a strategic objective, qualities all too rare in world history. The gulf between China and the United States in the early 1970s was far greater than it is now. China was in the midst of the turmoil of the Great Cultural Revolution, where gangs of teenage Red Guards were running amok throughout the country. The United States was bogged down in the Vietnam War on China's southern border, where Beijing was funneling supplies to Hanoi in its battle against the, quote, American imperialists, unquote. And it was shooting down U.S. aircraft that strayed into Chinese airspace. American prisoners from the Korean War were languishing in Chinese jails. Barely 2 months after Dr. Kissinger's secret visit to Beijing in July, to inform Chairman Mao that President Nixon was willing to visit China to forge a common front to bolster the position of both countries in dealing with the Soviet threat, the second most powerful leader in China, Lin Biao, died in a mysterious plane crash in Mongolia while trying to flee to the Soviet Union. At the time, Lin Biao was vice chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, defense minister, and Mao's designated successor. On the surface, conditions in China did not seem ripe for a major U.S. diplomatic initiative toward China. Yet President Nixon and Chairman Mao had the wisdom and courage to break through the wall of hostility and set their countries on a new and more beneficial path to the future. We should bear in mind that President Nixon's decision to risk his personal prestige and possibly his presidency on a trip to China was not based on secret information, but on international developments known to all. Skilled intelligence analysts had detected the emergence of the Sino-Soviet split as early as 1958. In 1960, Khrushchev withdrew over 1,000 Soviet technicians from China, which aborted some 200 joint scientific projects and worsened China's economic development. In subsequent years, during the 1960s, the ideological dispute between Moscow and Beijing had intensified. There were other signs of instability within the communist world. In 1968, Soviet forces invaded Czechoslovakia to oust a government that, in the view of Soviet leaders, was flouting socialist norms. This flagrant action was justified by the so-called Brezhnev Doctrine, which declared that Moscow had the right to intervene when a socialist country seemed in danger of backsliding from socialism. In Soviet eyes, the prime example of such a country was Maoist China, which was challenging the Soviet interpretation of Marxism. In the spring of 1969, armed clashes between Soviet and Chinese forces broke out on several disputed islands in the Ussuri River, which defined China's northeastern border with the Soviet Union. Chinese fears of Soviet intervention intensified, and Chairman Mao launched the slogan that Chinese should dig tunnels deep, store grain everywhere, and never practice hegemony, a code word for Soviet behavior. From the American standpoint, these developments, which were common knowledge throughout the world, seemed too good to be true. For over a decade, the alliance between the two principal enemies of the United States had been unraveling. The skepticism was such that well into the 1960s, substantial numbers of hardline anti-communists in the United States, including some noted academic China specialists, refused to believe the evidence and insisted the so-called Sino-Soviet dispute was a mirage designed to pull the wool over American eyes. In contrast, the American intelligence and policy communities had accurately tracked the emergence of the dispute, indeed beginning with the Kennedy administration and continuing during the Johnson administration. Some American leaders had understood the significance of these developments and felt growing frustration that the hostile relationship between Washington and Beijing, solidified by the Korean War, limited the ability of the United States to take full advantage of the worsening relations between Beijing and Moscow. But they lacked the vision and courage to develop a strategy to take advantage of these events. This is where the leadership of President Nixon made itself felt. While others rolled their eyes in amazement at the intensifying hostility between Moscow and Beijing, President Nixon saw an opportunity for a breakthrough with China that more conventional thinkers failed to see. We are all familiar with what happened next. President Nixon's triumphant foreign policy stroke was insufficient to salvage his second term from the consequences of some of his domestic actions. This led to his resignation from the presidency in August 1974. There is no question that President Nixon intended to complete normalization of U.S. China relations before the end of his second term in January 1977. Whether he could have done so remains an unanswerable historical question. The stumbling block was the thorny question of Taiwan. The United States still recognized the losing side in the Chinese Civil War as the government of China. This was the Republic of China, headed by President Chiang Kai-shek, which had retreated to Taiwan in 1949 as mainland China fell to the Chinese communists. President Truman's original decision not to intervene in the Chinese Civil War had been reversed by the outbreak of the Korean War in June 1950. As part of its response, the United States had strengthened security ties with the Republic of China, including the conclusion of a mutual defense treaty in 1954. Since then, the United States had deployed a limited number of U.S. military personnel on the island, mostly in an advisory capacity, and it was the principal source of weapons for the Republic of China Armed Forces. Both the People's Republic of China, headed by Mao Zedong, and the Republic of China, headed by Chiang Kai-shek, were equally adamant that foreign countries could only have official diplomatic relations with one or the other of the two contestants, but not with both. This is the origin of the One China policy that all countries, without exception, must adhere to in deciding whether to have official relations with Beijing or Taipei. President Nixon's visit to China was an unmistakable first step toward recognizing the PRC as the real government of China. But to complete the process, it was necessary to establish a framework for managing the problem of Taiwan. No other country faced a comparable problem in deciding to shift diplomatic relations from Taipei to Beijing. President Nixon laid the groundwork for addressing this task through the Shanghai Communique, a joint statement in which each side set out its position on Taiwan and on a variety of international issues. This task proved to be so difficult that it took over 6 more years and 2 more presidential administrations to accomplish it. In the meantime, the United States was in a precarious position. The president's visit to China had opened the floodgates for other countries to switch diplomatic recognitions from Taipei to Beijing. The United States was in danger of becoming isolated as one of the last major powers to establish diplomatic relations with Beijing. Clearly, the United States could not afford to sit on its hands. To facilitate communications between the two sides, Washington and Beijing in 1973 agreed to open unofficial liaison offices in the two capitals, staffed by diplomats who lacked formal diplomatic status. This was an important step forward, but it did not solve the problem of meeting the conditions for normalization with Beijing, which entailed breaking diplomatic relations with a friendly government, Taipei, ending the Sino-U.S. Mutual Defense Treaty with the Republic of China, and withdrawing U.S. military forces from Taiwan. Because of the magnitude of these steps and the complexity of managing relations with Taiwan after the anticipated break in diplomatic relations, 3 consecutive U.S. administrations made a concerted effort to establish ambassadorial level diplomatic relations with Beijing while retaining a reduced level of official or quasi-official relations with Taiwan. With this goal in mind, President Ford's Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, visited Beijing in October 1975, where he met with Chairman Mao and Deng Xiaoping. Secretary Kissinger explored with Deng the possibility of the U.S. retaining some form of a reduced official relationship with Taipei, but Deng was adamantly opposed. 2 months later, President Ford visited Beijing and informed Deng that he needed to postpone normalization until after his hoped-for re-election in November 1976. Deng was visibly upset and terminated the meeting early. Following Jimmy Carter's election in November 1976, Secretary of State Cyrus Vance visited Beijing in the summer of 1977 to explore once again the possibility of retaining some form of official relationship with Taipei following normalization with Beijing. Deng Xiaoping once again was unyielding. Based on this record, President Carter concluded that he would have to meet the 3 Chinese conditions. He was adamant, however, that the United States must retain the right to continue arms sales to Taiwan after we broke diplomatic relations with them. On a visit to Beijing in May 1978 by President Carter's National Security Advisor Brzezinski, agreement was reached to begin secret negotiations in Beijing in July 1978. Before beginning the negotiations, administration officials briefed the top leaders in both houses of Congress on a highly confidential basis regarding the president's willingness to meet the 3 Chinese conditions while continuing arms sales to Taiwan. The response was that the administration was doing the right thing, but that it should expect congressional criticism when it did it. The negotiations with Beijing concluded successfully in mid-December 1978, when the 2 sides issued a second joint communique announcing their intention to establish diplomatic relations on January 1st, 1979. However, disagreements over the arms sales of the United States to Taiwan continued to fester, leading to the conclusion of the third joint communique on August 17, 1982, which addressed that question. None of the 3 communiques was signed. This reflected Beijing's refusal, when the Shanghai Communique was issued, to sign any official documents with the United States government in the absence of full diplomatic relations. Since the U.S.-PRC diplomatic relationship rests on the understandings in the 3 joint communiques, each successive U.S. administration has had to reaffirm, when taking office, that it would remain faithful to these foundational documents. It is worth noting in conclusion that the shock to the international community of the announcement in December 1978 that the United States and the People's Republic of China would be establishing diplomatic relations was almost as great as the revolution 7 years earlier, that President Nixon would be visiting Beijing in 1972. Twice in a decade, the United States had been able to engineer major changes in its relationship with China in total secrecy. The impact of President Nixon's opening to China on the Soviet Union was the opposite of what many expected. Rather than worsening U.S. relations with Moscow, it produced an immediate improvement. Soon after his trip to China in 1972, President Nixon became the first American president to visit Moscow, where he signed a strategic arms limitation treaty and an anti-ballistic missile treaty, the first two major steps toward limiting the growth of nuclear arms. The prestige of American diplomacy was never higher. Working closely with his national security advisor, Dr. Henry Kissinger, President Nixon had set in motion an imaginative plan to create an opening to China based on his intuition that bold thinking and unconventional actions could change assumptions and open new and better opportunities for both China and the United States. His trip to China in 1972 vindicated his line of thought and cemented his place in history.